get out of the country.
Your passport.
February the 10th, 1928 is when I left. Get out of the country.
Your passport.
February the 10th, 1928 is when I left.
Your passport.
February the 10th, 1928 is when I left.
February when?
February the 10th, 1928. This is from the sub-prefect in Yaquiva. Passport to the Senora Marion Thede. Yaquiva. Passport to the Senora Marion Thede, who goes from here to Uyuni, Bolivia, and then goes on to Antofagasta, Chile. Five pages missing, it says.
What is that?
Evidently they wrote 5 pages missing. Why would that be? Here's the Matacos. We're talking about those Indians who were not civilized. There are some here who sure look wild, but they aren't. Oh, they're just like whipped dogs. They weren't wild. Some only have a loincloth and anklets on. They're only a little better than harmless beasts. As Billy says, they don't embarrass you with their nakedness, for they're animals, and animals don't wear clothing. I meet them in the road and don't even think them odd now, because I'm accustomed to seeing them. The Mataco Indian lives in a mud house about 4 or 5 feet high, with an opening, like the Eskimo ice homes, in which he crawls like a rat. I'll take some pictures of them when I find them. Serafina, the cook for us Murrays, was telling me about them. When the Matacos talk, it sounds like a lot of hogs grunting. Serafina belongs to the Guarani Indian. The Guarani language consists of quite a large number of words. In sound, the language is much like that of the Chickasaw Indians of Oklahoma. I'm crazy to learn my Spanish so I can begin to learn these Indian tongues. And then, speaking of the similarity of the languages, in Chickasaw, bull is Wakanukani. In Guarani, cow is vaca. And the meat from the cow is Wakachuchu. Wakachuku. Heaven sake. I'm learning something from my letters. Somewhere in here, I made a little dictionary of Indian words. It's somewhere in these letters. I had a big ironing this week, so I got Ferdinandina, an Indian woman, to come to help me. She ironed over 5 hours, and I paid her about 35 cents American money. Now that may seem awful to you to pay so little, but they are accustomed to it. Had I paid her more, she wouldn't want to work until she had spent it all. They can live on 10 centavos a day. Early morning they eat corn pounded up and browned over the fire and drink mate. At noon they have an asado of a few centavos of meat, garden vegetables, and maybe more mate. At night, parched corn and mate. Their huts of mud with grass roof, no windows, 2 doors, have nothing but a homemade chair, a box of sofa clothing, and a bed made of logs and corn stalks. In the summer, they drag the bed in front of the house to sleep. The houses are no more than 6 feet or so apart. Therefore, one sees a whole string of cots along the square in the twilight. Over the corn stalks, rawhide or cane stalks on the bed, they throw a cowhide and a thin blanket, and the bed is made. So this really describes it down to the last detail, even the food.
January 19th, 1982. This is Joe Todd. Interview with Mrs. Marion Thede, Thede.
Give me a hot check first for his rent, and then his poor old car gave out. He's having time. Then he got a car. Well, he's young. He's just 21.
Yeah. Interview in Northwest 23rd in Oklahoma City. Mrs. Thede, where were you born?
I was born in Davis, Oklahoma.
And when's your birthday?
November the 11th. I was born November the 11th, 1903.
1903. How long did you live in Davis?
About 14 years.
14 years. Who was your father?
James Drawn. He was a state representative from there, and then later on he was a state senator from Carter, Murray, and Love County.
Mm-hmm. And your mother's Lena Drawn, right?
Lena Drawn, and she was a music teacher.
What was her maiden name?
You will never believe it. Erdworm, E-R-D-W-U-R-M.
Okay. What are your first memories of Davis?
Let me see. The first memory I have, we were in a white house, and I was under school age. The house had a white picket fence all around the yard, and I heard this clattering coming from the east. So I hung on the gate and looked down that way, and here was a whole herd of longhorn cattle, and the clattering I heard was when their horns would touch each other. When one cow would hit the other ones with the horns, And they were driven by real cowboys, not drugstore type with sequins, but real old rough cowboys. And apparently they were driven from some ranches between Davis and Sulphur, and were being driven over to the railroad, which was about north and south down the middle of Davis. And we lived on the east side of Davis.
Yes. How old were you when that happened?
Well, I was, must have been 4 or 5.
What can you describe the town of Davis? Your
Yeah.
first memory of it.
Yes. My life was bounded by that house, and at that time I was maybe a block or two north of Main Street. My father's store was on Main Street, and of course there was no paving, but there were sidewalks. And to come to Main Street, I'd go to the corner, and there was an old rock building that was the Davis News building. There's Mr. Crossett had it, and set all the type by hand. And he bought this newsprint that had these lovely continued stories and all that stuff in it. And then he'd fill up the other page with local news. And we could hardly wait for a week to go by so we could continue with that continued story in there. And then I'd turn, after I got down to Main Street, I'd turn and walk on the north side of Main on the sidewalk, and would go past a variety of stores. I'd see Chickasaw Indians sitting out on benches. There was one in particular I remember. He was named Mr. Chigley. He was the original old man. I think he had several children of his own, and then he would take in a Chickasaw orphan that came along. His house was a big old Confederate-looking home with columns, white house, that was sitting in a cotton field northeast of Davis. You could look across the cotton field and see it. So I'd go past that, and Mr. Chigley, as an old man, would be sitting on one of those benches, and he's the only one that I remember of the Chickasaws who still wore what I would call pigtails. He had what hair he had left was braided in 2 neat little pigtails on each side of his head. But of course he wore trousers and all, just like anyone else. Then I'd go on down. The bank was on the corner, and right across the street from that was another bank, and then my father's store was next.
What was the name of your father's store?
H.C. Drawn's Sons Company.
What kind of store was it?
Hardware, furniture, and lumber. And that was my main place to go, because at 4 o'clock on a summer afternoon, I'd get my bath and I could walk down there and get a nickel from Papa. And then I'd go about a block on west, on the other side of the street, to the confectionery and spend my nickel for something sweet. And in this confectionery, Barnett's Confectionery, was another very early memory. The girl who waited on the candy where I would spend my nickel, or at least a penny of it, was cross-eyed. And that always mixed me up very much, because I would forget what kind of candy I wanted when I looked at those cross eyes. This was Barnett's Confectionery. And along on that side of the street were various grocery and dry goods, and there was a drugstore, and I think two on the corner of on the other side of the drugstore was a Freeman's department store. Oh boy, I loved to go in there, because one side smelled deliciously like cloth and the other side smelled like groceries, because he had a divided store. And that was very good. And then I had an older brother, 4 years older than I, and when he died in 1913 or 12, now this I don't remember, my father sold that house and he moved south of Main Street about 2 blocks to a 2-story house that was already there, 2-story white frame. And that's where I spent most of the 14 years, was in that 2-story white frame. And that's where my youngest sister was born. I had 2 sisters and a brother. He died. And then we lived in that one. And then every afternoon in the summertime, I'd take my little sister's hand and we would walk to Main Street and get that nickel. But we were afraid of my father because he had a very loud, blustery laugh, and he was huge. He was about 6'4" and weighed maybe 240 pounds or more. And we'd go and we wouldn't ask him for the nickel. We'd just stand there and look at him until he would laugh with that big laugh and give us the nickel. But we went to town on a sidewalk. But just a few years before I was born in 1903, there were no sidewalks there. It was a wilderness, because the original town of Davis was north of where it is now. It was on a creek, and it was not named Davis then, but there was a Mr. Davis that had a store there, close to this Chigley house. Then when the railroad came through, it didn't go by that settlement.
What year was that? Did the railroad come through?
You know, I don't know. I'd have to look that up. But it was prior to 1889, because my mother came up there on the train in 1889. She was born in 1879. So it was somewhere in the 1880s, I'd say, when they made the train. But so the train missed that little settlement by a mile or 2. So Mr. Davis and all the rest of them picked up and moved to the train, moved up and down the train tracks.
And that's why they call it Davis?
Uh-huh.
What's his first name?
Sam.
Sam Davis.
Now on the east side of the track, this my mother tells me, and we drew a picture of this settlement, and it's out at the Historical Society in a book called Davis, Oklahoma. In the back of it is this picture. But on one side of the tracks, they by now called this Main Street, and they'd straightened it out. Before that, it was just a trail that twisted around, went to Mr. Chigley's farm, and on up to that little settlement. But then they straightened this out and called it Main Street. But on one side of the track, and in 1889, there was this Mr. Davis on the east side, my mother's half-brothers on the west side. And Mr. Davis had seed, feed, and things like that. And my mother's half-brothers, the Erdworm brothers, had just a general store. And my mother said there was a boxcar for a depot when she came in. And there were just a few little houses right around those 2 stores. But then when she came back in 1896 to live, because her father had died, and her mother moved her and her 2 brothers up to Davis so that the 2 brothers could help out in the store. Then there were many more buildings and houses when she came 1896. So there was no sidewalk, but between 1896 and when I was born in 1903, they had made the concrete sidewalks. So when I'd walk up on these concrete sidewalks and everything, all the streets straightened out and all, and well sanded. It never occurred to me that just a few years before that, it was just all stumps where they'd cut down the trees to make the place.
When did you start to school?
I started when I was 6. We didn't have kindergarten.
What was the name of the school?
Davis Schools, and it was, I think the original building is still there. I've forgotten whether it is or not, but the original Davis School I never did go to. I went to what they call the new school, which is an old school now. But the original school, as I understand it, Mr. Chigley gave the land and the building, and there were two old buildings that I think are pictured in that Davis book. Two old frame 2-story buildings that seem to be put together, maybe like an L. I never did go to school there. I don't remember a thing about that one. That may have been torn down. But where I went to school was on a few blocks south of Main Street. And it's funny, they had the first and second grades, they had in the basement. And then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 7th and 8th, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th on the main floor, I think. And then the 9, 10, 11, 12 was upstairs.
Mm-hmm. Who are your teachers?
I don't remember one of them. Not one.
Do you remember World War I?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I remember. I was past 12, and I had no idea anything. Of course, we didn't have any radio, TV, or anything else. The news filtered down to us through the newspapers or through the wireless telegraph at the depot. But I can remember these boys who grew up in Davis and never had gone anywhere else. They thought it was romantic to really get in that war and go overseas. And the young girls thought it was very romantic to write letters to overseas. And all the women got together and made these unwearable socks and mittens and all that sort of stuff. And I can remember seeing them do that and rolling up bandages. And I remember writing one letter to somebody or other, who of course was older than I. And then I can remember the end of the war because there was a terrific clatter going on. And this was on my birthday. And I could see my father's car. By then he had a gray Case car made by the J.I. Case Company. And here this car came down the street from Main Street, and it had a lot of tin cans tied onto the back of it. And he was waving a flag, and he said, "The war is over." So we all piled in the car and rode up and down the streets, maybe all 2 of the streets or something, with these tin cans clattering along. And people put out flags and fired off their guns, and if they had any firecrackers, they did those too. It was something that sounded like a 4th of July celebration more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I can remember about World War I.
What kind of chores did you have to do at home?
I didn't have any chores. See, there were a lot of blacks in Davis. At the end of the Civil War, this was Chickasaw country where I was born. It wasn't a state yet. And at the end of the Civil War, the Chickasaws there had to let their slaves go. And the Chickasaws were the only Indian nation that didn't take in the slaves as citizens. They resisted and delayed until finally statehood came along, and the blacks never were taken in as Chickasaw citizens. So the blacks around Davis, simply the ones that didn't farm for somebody else, moved into town. They were on the west side of the tracks, and you could get somebody to work for $3 a week. And so I didn't have any chores. I didn't wash a dish until I was married that I recall at all. We had my grandmother and my mother, and there was always black help in the house. And we had a half block all in Bermuda grass, and so there was always someone outdoors doing that and working around. There was always someone working around the lumber yard, and none of us ever had any chores. Mm-hmm. The house was heated with coal that I can recall, and I don't think I ever lifted a shovel to put coal in there. There was always somebody else.
Sure. Now you moved from Davis when you were 14 years old? Where'd you move to?
Moved to Norman.
Okay, why'd you move to Norman?
I was ready for college at the age of 14 and too young, my mother and father thought, to go alone. So they tried me the year I was 14, and the summer I was 14, the summer I was 15. They tried me with my grandmother going up to Norman and taking a room, and she stayed up there for the summer session. Then they decided that they'd move to Norman with me.
And you entered college about 1917?
1918.
1918.
I entered the fall of 1918.
What did you study?
Music, of course. Everything music. I was crazy about writing. I took every English course that I could cram in with my music. Mm-hmm. And the way I got to take more hours than I should have was, I don't believe that it's possible to cheat like that now, but I didn't think it was cheating. I just wanted more hours because I wanted those writing courses. I'd write out my schedule, and then someone would sign it down here, but there'd always be room up there for me to add a course or two, so I'd just go up there after he'd signed and put in my courses. And by 3 years, in the spring of 1922, I graduated in music, but I also just lacked, I believe it was 14 hours of having a Bachelor of Arts. I went summer and winter.
Mm-hmm. Now, why were you ready for college at the age of 14?
Well, they sent me up there in the summer, and I completed my high school courses that way. And I lacked 1 credit of getting in, so, and it was English literature. So a marvelous professor, Hansel, gave me a book and told me to study it in August. And he'd give me a special test at the end of August. So I studied this English literature book and did some work at the library and took the test and got in. And they called me an unclassified student until the end of the first semester. And then I was a freshman.
Mm-hmm. After you got your degree, did you go ahead and get your Bachelor of Arts degree?
No, I never did finish it.
You didn't finish it?
I fiddled around and took a lot of other courses, but I never did finish the requirement for it because I lacked some science courses, I believe it was, that I would have had to take. And I didn't know anything about science. I didn't think I could pass that.
After OU, what'd you do?
Well, after OU, we moved to Tishomingo. My father's business had failed my last year in college. And so then he took a job as manager of a lumber company in Tishomingo.
1922?
Yes. And I went there, and so I thought, well, here I am 18, I can get a job. So I wrote voluminous letters all over the place, and didn't even get a reply back. After all, I was just 18 years old. Who would want a teacher 18 years old? So there wasn't anything else for me to do, and I enrolled myself in Murray School for that winter. And that's where I met Johnston and all the Murrays, because they just lived down the street from us.
How long did you go together before you got married to
Oh, just a few months.
Johnston?
Just a few months. We were married in June of that year that I completed at Murray.
The June of 23?
22.
22.
Could that be possible? No, I think it must have been 23, changed that. June 23, because I graduated in June 22. And then the next year was when we went to South America.
Why did Murray set up his colony in South America?
You know, since I've become an adult, I've often wondered about that, and I can't look into the man's mind. The only thing I can think of is that prior to that, he was defeated in his race for Congress. See, he was a congressman, and when he ran again, he was defeated. I think he took a stand against going into World War I. Now, see, I don't know this. And anyway, whatever the reason, he was defeated for Congress. And for 4 or 5 years after that, he traveled. And most of it was in South America. And see, the Murrays, Father and Mother Murray, were very frugal people. They were brought up that way. And I have the feeling that he must have saved nearly everything he made as a congressman. And that must have been what he traveled on. She had Indian land, and he had Indian land when he married. He got it when he married her. And all of the children, except the last one, had Indian land. Now, he didn't farm any of it. He may have used, the family had to have money. They probably used the money on the Indian land. The only thing I can think of is that he saved his money like mad while he was a congressman. But anyway, he traveled, and that's when he was hunting for a place, he decided, I guess, in his soul, that he had just had it with this country. It was going to, as they say, hell in a wheelbarrow, and he just wanted to get clear away. So he conceived of this idea. I understand from way back in my mind that someone else had had an idea like this before him, but it never had gone as far as his did. This may be mentioned in that last book, written by whoever that is, of this other person. It may not have even been in this state, but it was a colonizing scheme of some kind. But then you see, he traveled, as I understand it, in north of where we finally settled was practically an unknown country, and east of there.
Yeah, let me check that. You said the area north of the colony was an unknown country.
Oh, it was, and I understand that he traveled all up in there. and clear across in Brazil. Let me get this map. Was that Brazil? And he seemed to have been one of the first white people to go into this. Let me see now where else. Here's Bolivia.
Now here's Santa Cruz. You said that was north of the colony?
Yeah.
In Bolivia?
I think he must have traveled out in here.
What around?
But he went all around looking for land, you see. And apparently he didn't like the government, or he wasn't able to make a deal in Argentina. And I can understand that. Those people were hard to get along with. But he must have made the deal here in Bolivia because they actually wanted this land opened up. He traveled all in here too.
Around Santa Cruz, Bolivia?
Yeah. Traveled all in the department of Santa Cruz. But he was able to make a deal in Bolivia where he wasn't able to, or didn't like the land in the other places. Peru, there's nothing there that would be land that you could farm. It was either sea coast or it was mountains. Chile the same way. Argentina. I don't know unless he couldn't make a deal with them. But the land that I saw in Argentina, in the northern part of Argentina, didn't look as good as what we had. I think he was looking for land that was virgin land that they could clear and farm.
Well, why did he pick
that particular part?
Yeah. What's the name of the colony? Or the site where the colony was?
Aguarenda. Well, there was water. The altitude was just right. The railroad wasn't too many miles south, and the railroad was being built north, right? The railroad would have been within 2 or 3 miles of us, you see. So our products could have been taken to the railhead, to the railroad, easily from where we were in a few years when it opened on up, you see. And north of us, he couldn't have gone for the reason that the Standard Oil had leased that. And they had a Standard Oil camp north of us. In fact, we had the mineral rights too, and we probably would have been very rich if could have stayed down there. There was a place where we'd go up the creek up toward the mountains. We'd take a big leaf and hold it in the bank of the creek, and oil would drip into it, the leaf, from the bank of the creek. And we never thought about riches. We were just busy farming. But we thought it was kind of fun to see that oil drip out there.
So when did you left Oklahoma and you went to South America? Well, how did you get to South America from Oklahoma?
Well, of course, that was before planes. We went over to Ardmore and got our passports. And then Johnson and I took how we ever got over to Ardmore, I don't know. But anyway, we took a train at Ardmore and we went to New Orleans and bought some things down there. Father Murray, I don't believe, was on the train with us. I don't recall if he was at all. But after we got down there, I recall it because he brought my saddle in the hotel room. He brought both of our saddles, Johnston's and mine, in the hotel room and arranged a letter of credit with Chase National Bank. Now, where he got the money for this venture, I don't know where he got all the money for this venture, but where he got the part that the family used was from the sale of their lands around Tishomingo. See, all the children except the youngest, except Burbank, had Indian land, and his wife had Indian land, and he had Indian land.
How come Burbank didn't have Indian land?
He was born too late. The rolls were closed. And the older boys used to tease him and call him poor white trash because he didn't have any Indian land. And this land was very rich all around Tishomingo, rich land. I think Billy's was less rich than the others, but so the term $50,000 sticks in my mind. Whether that's how much they had in the 1920s, that was a lot of money. Whether that was what the family had, I have no idea. But you see, we didn't have to pay for the land after it got down there. It was a 99-year lease. And what we had to do, though, was ship medicines and everything that we'd need for a commissary down there. Sewing machines, everything like that.
Did you bring all this stuff with you, or did
Yeah.
you ship it down later?
It was shipped down, but not with, Johnson and I went on ahead. We went on ahead a few months, I don't remember.
Now you say you went from New Orleans to Cuba?
Cuba.
Now why did you go to Cuba first?
We had to take that English ship.
What
The
was
English
name?
ship didn't stop in New Orleans. The English ship was on the way from England, and it stopped in Cuba and went on through the canal.
Yeah, what was the name of the ship?
Did they say Orita
Orita.
in those letters of mine? And then we went through the canal and down the coast, down the west coast. And I think, now I'll have to check with Frankie Murray, Messina's widow, but I think Johnson and I got off at La Quiaca.
It's in Bolivia?
No, Bolivia doesn't have a seacoast.
Okay.
La Quiaca, Chile. And then we went, and at that time, now this was in the early 20s, but there was still a dislike of North Americans, of people in the United States.
How come?
I don't know, but we were admonished by our consul or whatever in New Orleans not to speak English on the street. So there had been some trouble. In the history books, one might be able to research and find it.
So you spoke Spanish in the streets?
Oh, we didn't know Spanish. We didn't know it at all. But we just kept our mouths shut on the streets. And we wouldn't have known where to go for a room, but Father Murray had arranged an itinerary for us, and we just followed it. And he wrote down the words that we'd need to get us from one place to another till we caught on to Spanish, which didn't take us very long after we'd made a few mistakes, particularly in eating, where we sit down with this menu and just point at something, didn't know what it was. But it didn't take us long to pick up a few words here and there. So we were at this town, I think it was La Quiaca, and then we waited, and then there was a train that went up to a certain place, and that was the end of the train. It hadn't gone clear across the Andes. They were still laying track, and that's when we got this Ford car that ran on the track and took us to where there was some more train. I suppose they were building it from both ends like they did in the United States, and it hadn't met yet.
Mm-hmm.
So then we went up to La Paz. We had business up there. We had to deposit our passports, something, and make arrangements, and I suppose deposit this information about the colony with the proper authorities. And then from there after we had established that, we went south and went into Argentina. Went to Buenos Aires. What we were doing there, I have no idea, but we must have had business there. What it was, I don't know. I was too young to care. I was enjoying life, I had never been anywhere. And neither had Johnson. We were having the time of our lives. And then, after we were there, then we began to get out into the Pampas part of Argentina, where it was flat cattle country. I don't remember seeing any wheat growing, but it must have. But then it took a lot of acres in those days for one cow. It didn't look to me like they had as good grass as we did. So we bought cattle, and we bought horses and mules.
In Buenos Aires?
No, out at Rosario, Tucumán, and Córdoba. Those three places. And these were paid for by these letters of credit on the Chase Manhattan Bank by Johnson. He had, what do you call it, power of attorney to do this. In the meanwhile, the colonists had been gathered up, and they all met in New Orleans.
How many were there?
Well, this, I think, according to these letters that I'm giving, it said there were 46 counting the two of us, so there must have been 44. That was the first wave of them, like in Israel, with Aliyah, the first Aliyah, and the second Aliyah, and so on. First wave of colonists, and there was a second wave and a third wave. But this first wave that went down with the Murrays was that many. And so they all met, and they got on a boat and made their way. And I understand that they got off at Antofagasta, Chile, and came on to the railhead, to the end of the railroad in Argentina, where Johnson and I met them. We weren't quite at the end of it, but I remember when we pulled in, I don't know where the colonists were. I guess they were not at the station. When we pulled in, I can remember Burbank as a kid of 14 or 15 or 12 or something, running down the track in a loop when he saw us and grabbing us around the neck. And then we went on, but where we stopped on the train was this embarcacion. That was the end. And there we camped. And I don't know what we'd done. Oh, well, it wasn't going to rain because it was in the dry season. Now, you see, Oklahoma farmers don't know anything about dry season. They do now, but then they didn't. They'd never heard of such a thing as a dry season and a wet season. We got there in the dry season, and the Indians thought this was the funniest thing in the world to see those farmers out trying to plow and plant in the dry season. And Father Murray couldn't get them to stop. And that was the beginning of what was said in these letters about altercation between him and the colonists. You can imagine somebody who couldn't plow, who plowed on this hard earth in the dry season, and put corn and stuff in there. He wasn't going to, why, be eaten up by the rats and the animals before it would come up in the rainy season. See, the season, the beginning of spring was in November.
Did you realize this when you went down?
I did, yeah, but these farmers couldn't understand that. And also Saturday night came and they wanted to go to town. They wanted a town to go to. One or two of them would drift down to one of the Indian huts. And we just thought this was absolutely terrible because they'd go down there and drink with the Indians. Well, those Indians could drink all night and they weren't in the least in a fighting mood. But one of these colonists, foolishly got half drunk, and then he tried to take hold of one of the Indian women, and then he got his head bashed in. But that was about the only time that I can remember any trouble whatsoever. And we thought that was the worst disgrace in the world, that anybody would do a thing like that.
What were they drinking?
Chicha. This was made from fermented corn. You want me to tell you how it was made? It looked like gray dishwater with a little bit of foam on top and not much. They'd chew corn and spit it into a jug, an olla, a big one,
Mm-hmm.
and the sugar from the spittle would cause it to ferment. They'd add some water. That's the way they made this chicha. It was corn water, but the first of it was chewed, and they seemed to have professional chewers, because you could always tell their teeth were worn off in front. Men and women, these professional chewers, their teeth. So they would drink that and just get so happy and beat their drums and sing. But they didn't ever get mean when they were just happy. They didn't get mean at all. I didn't know any mean Indians down there. The only mean ones that I can remember were the mixed Spanish and Indian that lived in the towns. There were a few of those.
What was the nearest town to the colony?
2 miles, El Palmar. It was just, I can't think of a town in Oklahoma that would be that small. It was just a little collection of houses, and didn't have church because they came up to our church. A little old one room about the size of this, about 15 by 17. That was a school.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one store, very small.
One store?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of store was it?
It was a general store. You never saw anything like it except in the early days of Oklahoma. They had a little bit of everything, including it was the post office and the general hangout. There was one corner of it where there was a table or two and they could drink beer.
Mm-hmm. When you first went there, what'd you live in at the colony?
Well, we lived in the abandoned mission buildings that had been built, I don't know how many years before, maybe 100 years before. But the buildings were not bad, except the part that Johnson and I lived in, they're pretty tight. But the one that was used as a commissary, the big one where we all camped when we first went down there, we all camped in this one place, and we'd hang up sheets to separate the beds. And that roof leaked like a sieve. There were beams that were, it looked to me, at my age, as if the beam was as wide as this couch.
About 2 feet.
Yeah, there were beams that ran across to support, and you look up, and above the beam there was no ceiling, but above the beam there were first looked like cane stalks, and then above that were tiles, red tiles. Well, okay, you can guess that we heard the awfulest chattering up there. And Father Murray said it was the lions of the pampas. What in the world's that? Rats. They lived up in those cane stalks up there, and they'd run across those beams. These big rats. And one night, 2 of them got fighting. They fell down on our bed. There were no screens. Nobody ever heard of a screen there. No window panes, but there were shutters against the heat, not against the cold. And the way you made yourself amateur air conditioning was, early in the morning when it was cool, you closed those shutters, and understand that this was 18 inches through these, from the outside to the inside of these buildings, 18-inch walls. So each window was real deep, 18-inch deep, and there were bars, but the shutters were on the inside, so when you close the shutters early in the morning, then you'd sprinkle the brick floor with water, and it kept it cool all day, as long as you kept the shutters closed and keep sprinkling these bricks now and then. Then the colonists all moved to their land after it was surveyed. But see, it had to be surveyed first.
Who did the surveying?
Well, I think it said in those letters, Father Murray and the boys and some of the colonists surveyed. And they all moved to their land, but they didn't have any houses yet, so they camped out in tents, this, that, and the other. I don't believe any of them had any buildings on their land. And Father Murray kept this one beautiful place, Ojo de Agua, for his wife. He said that was Alice's. But the Indians never did move off of there, and we never did. None of them ever moved on to it. But it was absolutely a gorgeous place. It had palm trees. We used to go over there, and it was really gorgeous. Palm trees and banana trees, everything there. And then Johnston and I moved from that one place out of that walled-in place, and
The walled-in place.
where it was where there was an adobe wall in a square around this original big building where the commissary was.
Now, who had built this mission originally?
The Catholic fathers, the Catholic Church, had built it when they were Christianizing these Indians many, many years before.
It's still in good shape then?
Yeah, fair. But like I say, this one big one, it leaked like a sieve till they could go up on top of there and replace some of those tiles and get rid of the rats. But you see, these had been unoccupied buildings for a long, long time. And then Johnston and my 2 rooms were through the big tiled gate and just a few steps, slightly uphill, to part of the original old school. We occupied 2 rooms there. And then, of course, we had a patio, but that was not a beautiful patio like the other one. This was the one where you drove the animals in at night. If you wanted to get going, say, real early in the morning, you'd have your horse right there. And on the other side of that patio was the priest's quarters. And back of his quarters was a large garden. It must have been several acres because we had to ride right by it, and it had a wall running all around it, as far as we could tell. We had to ride right back by it when we rode up toward the mountains. And that's when we saw his water supply of an aqueduct, where he diverted the water, the creek water, from up closer to the mountainside and diverted it, and it ran on in logs, split palm logs.
Kind of an aqueduct affair.
It was an aqueduct, and it went into his garden that way. And then what wasn't used in there ran through a hole in his garden wall into our pool and through our patio. But that did divert most of the water at the crossing, the creek crossing, in the dry weather. Now in the rainy season, that became a raging torrent. Nobody could get across it. So I can remember one time in the rainy season when there was no way we could get to market to buy anything, and I've never been able to look a black-eyed pea in the face since. We had black-eyed peas for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For about 3 weeks, we lived on black-eyed peas till the water went down. Well, that's no worse than down by the Arbuckles, where some relatives of mine live, and up above Turner Falls. There was a creek. They had a beautiful house up there on the side of the mountain, but I looked down the hill and, well, you just ford that creek. What do you do in the rainy season? He said, we just don't ford it. We just stay up here. And that was just maybe 8 years ago. and a lot of people don't.
How much land did you have in the colony?
I think there was 10,000, if not in hectares, I'd say 10,000 acres. And I think these two, 10,000, 8,000, stick in my mind. I think there were 10,000 in that one and 8,000 up in the mountains.
So how much land did each colonist have to
That I don't
farm?
know. But it was probably spelled out in the prospectus.
Yeah.
They could buy, in other words, whatever amount of money they had to spend.
Now, could you actually buy the land?
Well, I mean, they would lease it or whatever.
What was the major crop that you planted?
Oh, let's see, just a diversified crop: sugar cane, cotton, corn, garden vegetables.
Can you tell me what your average day was like? What time you'd get up? What you would do?
Oh, it was lots of fun. And I just could not stand it now, but that was the biggest adventure of my life. And I've never been as happy as I was down there. We'd get up, say, after a number of months in the rainy season, all of our clocks quit, but that didn't matter. We could tell by the light. We'd get up, you know, at the first crack of dawn, and we had to use lanterns or oil lamps. We'd get up the first crack of dawn and get breakfast, and then all the men would take off to clear and make roads and this, that, and the other, just like they did in the early days in the West. Just clear the land, make the roads, and all this, that, and the other. And so that would leave the women. You'd think the women didn't have anything to do. But right after breakfast, you had to start preparing for lunch, because there was no opening of cans, believe me. It was all from scratch. And if anything, any vegetables were to be prepared, you had to go out and pick them. And of course, before we got our first crops, we had to buy from the Indians. They just felt rich, those few things we bought from them. Then you should have seen our meat supply. That was fun. I don't remember any small game, like squirrels and rabbits. I never think I ever saw one. I don't think there was very much small game where we were at all. I think there was some, maybe bobcats or something like that in the mountains, and deer, but I never did see any. When I was down by the creek one day, yes, I do recall that there must have been deer, because I was sitting there and listening to the rippling of the water and thinking, that water sounds a little bit higher than an A on the violin, see, and I was listening to see what note that was that the water made, and I heard a pebble move, and I looked up, and facing me was a deer. And we looked at each other a while, and then the deer turned around and left. But I do know that a mother deer was killed by accident, and Johnston brought me the skin of the unborn baby deer. And that's one of the things that's down at OU now, is this little skin with the little spots on it. Getting back to this, then see, they had sheep and goats, cattle, but when anyone would kill a beef, I don't recall if the Indians had cattle. If they did, it wasn't around where I was. But somebody would kill a beef, and it would be for sale in El Palmar. So we would buy part of it, you know, a leg or something, but there was no way to keep this cool. So it had to be eaten immediately.
Yeah.
So it was gorge yourself and then do without meat for quite a while. And Mother Murray did remember from Indian days that they used to fix beef jerky. And so there'd be these strips of beef hanging over a slow fire out in the middle of the patio. she'd be fixing some of this. And you know, after it's dried enough, you can pound it up. Well, we were practically living back 75 years before that time in Oklahoma. That was the way we lived. Yeah, we'll get to find out.
Mr. Marion.
Mr. Murray, before
Paraguay.
we went down there, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, Peru, all over, and Chile, all those places. Probably Colombia and the other places north. I didn't hear anything about that. Now let's see. We've got to how we got up. All the men took off to the fields.
What would you have for breakfast?
What do we have? Depending on whether the creek was up or not. No, usually when the creek wasn't up, I learned to make biscuits without a recipe, believe me, after a few trials. And Mother Murray, we ran out of baking powder. But she knew the Indian way of making baking powder.
How's that?
Soda and something, really. She'd make it up for us. But she couldn't make up very much at a time in the wet season because it would mold, you know, everything would mold. Your shoes would mold overnight. But we'd have biscuits, and if we did anything else, we'd have gravy. Biscuits and gravy, or biscuits and eggs until we could get our flock going. Oh, yes, he took down some chickens, some hybrid chickens. They were coal black and not very large. What is the name of that chicken? I can't remember. It was a small black chicken. He took down enough to start a flock. He took down 2 goats, prize Kansas goats, a nanny and a daddy. And he took down some purebred dogs. Let's see what other animals he took. He didn't take down his sheep. He got the sheep in Argentina. I guess it was the purebred goats and the dogs and the chickens that he took down. Now, Johnston made a mistake. He didn't realize that you can't take a purebred animal that's been brought up in a stable and curried and petted and treated like a purebred. You can't take it and turn it out on the range. And his long-legged, black, beautiful horse died. But my little Argentine mare didn't die. She survived okay. Now, for breakfast we had whatever we could. If we had meat, we had meat. If not, we had biscuits, gravy, or biscuits and eggs. We had coffee, and we had to, there was no such thing as buying ground roasted coffee. We had to buy the coffee beans, and we would roast them. And every time we'd roast them in the oven, it'd come out tasting different. Sometimes it'd be not roasted enough, sometimes over roasted. So we never knew, but we lost our taste for coffee before very long, and we went to tea. But we couldn't get tea very well, so we went to mate. Mate was the tea that they, I think most of it was grown in Peru.
It's a native tea?
Yeah, native tea. It had a kind of sickening taste at first, but I learned to like it. And Father Murray just had a big liking for that tea. So the longer we lived down there, the more native we became, you see. First, we wanted everything just like in Oklahoma. But we soon got over that, but the colonists couldn't take it. These colonist farmers just couldn't take it. So they all went back, 1 or 2 at a time, drifting back.
Did they really know what they were getting into when they went down?
I don't believe they did. They read the prospectus, everything, but I don't believe they understood it.
Did they know where South America was?
I doubt it. I doubt if some of them even knew it. For this reason, that one of them, while Father Murray was in South America, a farmer came by the house. He said he wanted to speak to Mr. Murray. Mother Murray said, well, he's in South America. And the man said, oh, and then he said, well, will he be back tonight or tomorrow? See? And that's the type that we had, and they just couldn't be handled. Anybody that would get out and try to plow and plant in the wrong season, but to him in his mind, it was the right season. See, which was May or June or whatever. That was the time. But it wasn't. That was fall. And Father Murray tried to have them quit. They just wouldn't do it. They just get out there and plow. But the one of them that we thought was so disgraceful was that he came down there with his wife, who produced a baby right on the train. We thought that was the most disgraceful thing we'd ever heard of, besides the one that nearly got his head bashed in. Mm-hmm. But as far as our family was concerned, I had no idea that Father Murray was doing anything but enjoying life just as much as I was. Oh, I just loved the whole thing. It was just one big adventure. And for the first time in my life, I was out of school. You know that? From the time I was 6 years old till I got married, I'd been in school. And I already had a job when I married. I had a job to teach in Davis, teach the 5th grade. I lasted 2 months before I resigned.
Okay.
Well, heck, I was married. My young husband was in Tishomingo. I was in Davis. That didn't work. So I quit. I didn't want to teach anyway. I was too interested in being married. And by then we knew we were going to South America in the spring. But in these letters that I'm going to give you, it tells what we had for lunch and all. And when we first went down there, we tried to pattern it just exactly like a lunch or a dinner in the middle of the day would be in Oklahoma, but it didn't work out that way finally. You have to go native if you... For one thing we gave up right away was bacon. Nobody had any bacon. And until we got our chickens going, we didn't have any eggs either. We'd buy one huevo from the Indians. They never did sell by the dozen because they never did have that many. They'd come up with one egg to sell. Or they'd come in the commissary and they'd want to buy something in there and pay for it with this one egg. See, that's the way we got our eggs for a while. And it was great, this biscuits made without egg or baking powder for a while too. You know, it's kind of glom up something with water. We didn't have any milk either. But we were just as happy as we could be. And I learned to ride horseback the hard way, like I say in that letter, from the end of the railway up to our home. I rode horseback for the first time in my life. Talk about saddle sore. I could hardly get on and off the horse. I had to be lifted off.
After you moved on your land, what kind of house did you live in?
Lived in the abandoned mission rooms.
Did you say that you moved out to your land? You still lived in the mission, though?
Mission for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And see, there had to be a road cleared past where we were going to live. And there had to be some sort of shelter put up. So they put up the roof and the supports, and we moved in. And then there was going to be a well just a little way there. They dug and dug and dug. See, there was no drilling. You just dug a well, just like they did in the early days in Oklahoma. That's the reason the wells were so big, you had to get down there and dig. And then how did you get the dirt up the top? It had to go up in a basket or some kind of a bucket. It was very slow. And this particular soil was very sandy. As they went down to get water, the sides had to be shored up with logs to keep it from caving in.
Did you find water?
No, we never did find water. That's the reason we had to move back to the mission. But then our place with just a roof on it, it had a roof and a fireplace. Now, wasn't that fun? Oh, that was more fun for me, a roof and a fireplace. That was just great. And the fireplace was so big that I could build a fire in one end of it and stand in the other end and dress. And when it was cool.
How big of a place was it?
It was probably 20 by 40, something like that. And then the Murrays, the older Murrays, with their younger children, didn't live. Well, if it had been a city block, they would have lived at the other end of the block. We could see our houses. That's the reason I said I was sitting out the back laying in wait for Mother Murray. It was just a little ways to their house. And they had a roof and supports, but they went ahead and built the sides to theirs. And for the life of me, I cannot remember. I don't think there were more than 3 or 4 rooms. Nobody had a big house. I don't remember a big house anywhere around here.
How long did the colony last? How many years?
Let's see. What year was that? Was that 1924?
24.
24, and then I said, didn't I say in 20? At the end of 27, they were going back. It must have lasted about 3 years. And you see, then, when he didn't fulfill his contract called for 75 colonists, I believe. I may be mistaken. We'll check. But anyway, he could not fulfill his contract. And so there were noises of their taking back the land. He had sunk every dime he had into building these roads and bring all that stuff down, medicines and everything else, the cotton gin. And he hardly had any cash. And every time a colonist would want to go home, he paid the whole caboodle of them to go back. He gave them everything he had. The last of the colonists, he gave them enough money to get there. What they did with that money, I don't know, if they didn't handle it right. And when they got to a certain place, they didn't have any money to go on. And there was money made up on the ship for that family to get back home. And they hardly stepped off till they started talking what a rat Father Murray was, you see. He couldn't give them back all their money. He couldn't give them back the money that they had spent getting down there. He didn't have it. The colony hadn't been going long enough to start producing. Well, then the Bolivian government changed. If you know anything about Bolivia, in the last 100 years, there have been around 120 changes of government. And there's always a takeover. It's worse than Argentina. I believe it's the worst place in the world for changes of government. And when this government changed, well, they started making noise about they'd like to have that land back. What they wanted to do is the Standard Oil had decided they wanted to lease our land. They had heard about where you could go back down this creek and see the oil coming out. And they offered, if the Bolivian government could get that land back from the Murray colony, they wanted to lease it for a big amount of money, which they did, I think. And I believe that's the reason for the church falling down and the Indians being gone. I have an idea there was an old oil field right there within a few years after we left. But I went down there ahead with Johnston. Now the reason I got this map out is that the last year I was there, the reason I decided to come back for a visit, this was not to come back forever. because I just wanted to come back for a visit. There has always and still is a border dispute between Paraguay and Bolivia right in here. The troops were coming from La Paz across the mountains to go to war, and they were coming right by my door on that road. And here I had a baby. So my father sent me the money to come back home for a visit. Well, I came back home and I didn't have any money, and they didn't have any money to send me. So I got back in March, and whether it was 1927 or 28, I can't remember, except you can look in those letters. I got back in March, and in June I enrolled at OU to pick up some courses so that I could teach English and Spanish, and maybe a combination of orchestra. And so I enrolled in OU in some education courses, and so on and so forth. And I was just desperate. I wanted a job so badly. In August, I got one for all of $135 a month up at a little place called Amarita, Oklahoma, which is about 50 miles west of Enid. So the Murrays were still down there. So I had to leave my baby with my mother in Norman, that's Johnston Jr., and go up there to this little town, which was clear off the railroad. I think it had 150 people in it. And it was a consolidated school. I taught English, Spanish, and orchestra. But I got $10 extra for the orchestra. So I made $145. And at the end of that year, the superintendent of the school system moved to Oilton. And he asked me if I would like to teach in Oilton. Well, that was that much closer to Norman, where the baby was. So I said yes, and I got the same salary there. So I was in Oilton when the Murrays came back. I was teaching. Johnson didn't have a job. I didn't know how to handle it. He didn't either. We were babes in the woods. Our parents didn't help us. They didn't put any sense in our minds either.
Yeah. That you had a job and Johnston didn't, and...
Oh, we couldn't get together. There was no place for him in Oilton. I had a room with another teacher.
Now, was this in 28 or 29 when the Murrays came back?
I guess it was 29. And we just drifted apart, and then when we wanted to get together, through no fault of either one of us, we were both just young and didn't know how to handle it, someone else had come in the picture with him. And so we just didn't get together. And then my father died, and I moved with my mother and two young sisters to Oilton. My mother taught piano. My older sister went to OU, and my younger sister was in high school, but she taught dancing. So we just got along just fine. And time went on. But it was sad that things had to work out like that. Young people in those days were not nearly as smart as they are now about living, about how to get together.
How long were you married to Johnston?
About 5 years.
5 years?
6 years, something like that. I guess 6 years. We were always the best of friends. All the way to the very last, we were just the best of friends.
As an overall picture of the colony, what are your thoughts about it?
The most marvelous time of my life. I've never felt as happy since then as I did down there. It was just absolutely marvelous. And the longer we lived there and the more we met people in the community, the better it was. It was just so happy.
Was there much interaction between the colonists and the Indians down there?
No. But there was between us and the Indians, between the Murrays and the Indians, and between the Murrays and there's the Germans north of us that had a place, and between us and people who lived in the towns. We'd go and visit in their houses, go to weddings, go to theatrical events, which were probably real, not much, but anyway, it was fun.
Hmm. How large is the colony at its largest? How many colonists went down?
Well, like I say, I just don't know. That first wave was 46. Then there were 2 other waves. Mm-hmm. But some of them going back and some of them coming, I just don't know.
You mentioned that Murray couldn't get 75 colonists down there.
Yeah. Now we'll have to check with Frankie to see if that was 150 he was supposed to have.
Okay. Had not Standard Oil tried to get the land, do you think the colony would have survived?
There's 2 ifs. If the Standard Oil hadn't come in to want to lease that land, and if the government had been stable, the Murrays could have made a deal with the Bolivian government. I bet they could have got it for $1 an acre or 50 cents an acre, mm-hmm. or whatever. See, and bought it outright. But there was no opportunity. Oh, we would have stayed down there. We didn't want to come back. Hmm. But you see, then when he got back broke, no land here, the only other thing he knew was to run for office, which he did and was successful.
Can you give a good description of Father Murray, William H. Murray?
First time I ever saw him was, I was 18 in Tishomingo, and I was on one side of Main Street opposite the drugstore, and I saw this apparition on the other side. I'd never seen a man like this. When he walked, it was in large steps, and he lifted his knees so high, it made you think he was walking over plowed ground. And this was in July, and this man had on a pith helmet, the first I'd ever seen outside of an old silent movie. And holding up above his head was a Japanese umbrella with flowers on it. My gosh, who is that? Don't you know who that is? That's Mr. Murray. Well, I just stared at the man and he had this handlebar mustache too. But I was just fascinated at this man because he was so different. And when Johnston and I married, you see, Father Murray, you'd call him a bigot now because he didn't like Jews and he didn't like blacks, except in their place. The Jews didn't have a place. The blacks had a place in his mind, but the Jews didn't have any place at all. Well, my mother is half Jewish. I'm 1/4. If I were an Indian, I'd be called an Indian. 1/4, you know. Well, my father didn't want any of his family to marry an Indian. Johnston was about 1/16 Indian. Johnston. When we got married, my father said, my daughter is not even of age, and she has to marry a blank blank Indian. Father Murray was going all around town saying, of all people, Johnston had to pick out a blank blank Jew. And they were both talking about getting this marriage annulled. See, Johnston wasn't of age, and we just went over to someplace, to Davis, and got married. You know, Sulphur. We went to Sulphur and got married in the back of a jewelry store. And so that was so funny. I can remember that, and we all laughed about it afterward. But I had never known. See, I was so petted, I might say. I'd never had to do anything, no chores. The only thing I had to do was go to school, come home, and start practicing. So I had never been around anybody like that. The only men I knew were businessmen, my father's and mother's friends. And Father Murray at home would spout off history just like he would when he was speaking. That was no pose he put on. He was that way at home as well as outside. And he didn't just pet me any old way. And I'd pick this up from my mother. I said, well, I don't like that dress, or I don't like the way this room is built, or this, that, and the other, you know. And we had been married about a month when I was standing in his kitchen. And I was saying, well, I don't like the way this house is, the way the rooms are arranged. I think if I built a house, and when I got to that, he said, Marion, did it ever occur to you that nobody cares what you like or don't like? We didn't build this house for you, we built it for ourselves. You know, he didn't beat around the bush at all. He just came right out. And he was that way all the time. Well, I was so embarrassed. No one had ever talked to me like that. But I tell you, I learned more from him and his wife than from any other two people. His wife was the closest to a saint that I'll ever know.
That was Alice?
Alice, she was absolutely wonderful. Tall, she was almost as tall as he was. I bet she must have been 5'11".
How tall was he?
He was 6 something, 6 maybe 2. But she was tall for a woman. And looked very Indian, although she was 2/16. That's all. But she was very Indian in her appearance and in her living. And she never called Father Murray anything but Mr. Murray. She never called him by his first name. She was, in those days, an old maid. When they married, she was 25. And she was teaching in Bloomfield Academy, south of Durant at the time. And he was the secretary to her uncle, Douglas Johnston, of the Chickasaw Indians, Governor Douglas Johnston. That's the way they met. Her uncle was also, I think, at that time, the superintendent of Bloomfield Academy. So they met that way. And every one of the children was a character. Messina was one of the funniest people that I ever was around. He could imitate people's gestures to perfection. And Johnson was just a happy-go-lucky, always had a joke. Billy was more morose than the others. He had a streak of like his father, but he wasn't. He didn't have he had all the idiosyncrasies of his father without having his intelligence. Billy did. He was a lovable fellow. They all were. They had one daughter, Jean. She was mentally retarded. And Mother Murray always said she was what's the word? Let me search for a word. Anyway, I'll say this. When Mother Murray, before Jean was born, she was up in Guthrie, upstairs, and the Constitutional Convention was going on. Or else statehood, I don't know which. I have to figure it out. She was upstairs in some rooms, and these boys, these three active boys, were running up and down the stairs and out on the street, and she was afraid that some of the politicians would say something about her unruly children, and she was running up and down stairs taking care of them. And this girl, she said, was a victim of the state of Oklahoma, because when the girl was born, she had a bad case of jaundice and was mentally retarded. She was a sweet character too. Then the youngest one, Burbank, was named for Luther Burbank. Oh, he was a doll. And he went to OSU and graduated in electrical engineering, and went north somewhere around Milwaukee, and worked for the same company. It wasn't International Harvester, but it was a big company. Retired up there.
And he still lives up there.
Yes. At that address that I gave you.
Yeah.
Jean died.
That's the girl.
Jean had a stroke and died. She lived to be about 50. And
That Johnson just died recently, didn't he?
yes. Now, Messina died about 20 years ago of a heart attack. And Billy, I can't remember whether he died after or before that of cancer. And Johnston, though, lived until just a few years ago. And on the
Recently, didn't he?
yes. Now, Messina died about 20 years ago of a heart attack. And Billy, I can't remember whether he died after or before that of cancer. And Johnston, though, lived until just a few years ago. And on the day of our 50th wedding anniversary, he came by here and he was a Mason. And after the 33rd degree, which is honorary, there was a Masonic order that was of these later years called the Jesters. He gave me his little Jester's pen, which I still have, a little gold. See, 50th wedding anniversary. And I gave him a gold pencil and pen set. And
Did Mr. Murray ever talk at the Constitutional Convention?
did he ever talk about it? You see, he had his mind on this colony. I married in Messina, and Frankie married the year before he went down with the colony, both of us. And he had his mind on the colony, and he spouted history all the time, but it seemed to me that he was talking about French history, French Revolution, and American Revolution at the time we married. And then he was busy getting all this colony together. So I don't believe that he ever talked to me about it. I don't recall that he ever did.
You ever studied the Sequoia Convention?
Beg your pardon?
Ever studied the Sequoia Convention?
Did I?
Yes.
Yeah.
You ever know anyone that attended that convention?
No. I don't recall that I did. I may have, but I didn't know they were in it. No, the Sequoia Convention, I would have been too young. I was born in 1903.
Well, it was 19...
5 or 6, maybe. Because statehood was 1908.
1907.
1907, yeah. So I was just 4 years old then. So I wouldn't remember it. But if I knew any of them, I probably didn't recognize the fact that they had been in the Sequoia Convention.
Did you support Governor Murray?
Oh, absolutely. I fought the Murray fight all the way down the line from the time he got back until Johnston was in office. In fact, Johnston nearly got defeated by a character named Cole, William S. Cole, because Cole put out the story in the late summer that young Johnston and I were on the road with his group fighting against Johnston. And I tried to keep in the background because Johnston and Willie were married. But at that time I had leased part of Larson Music Company's store when it was downtown on First Street, and I had the phonograph record department. And where I got wind of it was that everybody likes to come in an art store or a bookstore or a record store, and they like to talk. They get real friendly with whoever they're buying from. This fella came and says, "Boy, have we ever got old Johnston Murray nailed to the wall." Says his wife is out with the Cole faction with her son, and they're working against him. I said, "Is that so?" There I stood, you know, I was the wife. He didn't know it. And so I tried to get hold of Willie, tried to get hold of Johnston. I couldn't get hold of them. I called the headquarters. They wouldn't give me the office, the number where he was. And finally, somebody told me his campaign is being run by such and such an advertising agency. And I said, "Why, I know somebody in that agency." So I called my friend George Ande, who was a musician in the symphony with me, and explained it to him. I said, "George, I've got to get hold of Johnston. Something's got to be done. I have to come out for him in some way. I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to." And so who did I get a call from but Willie? And they were ensconced at what was then the Oklahoma Club. I left the store. I got one of my customers to stand behind the counter. Left the store and went over there and met them at the Oklahoma Club. And arranged with Willie and Johnston at that time and somebody else who was in there. And all of this by then was being recorded on an old wire recorder, all of our conversation and everything. And we arranged that there would be a mass meeting at the Skirvin Tower, I believe it was, and that I would have to show up and make some kind of remarks. They also put out the story that Johnston deserted me and my son. And so I was married, and when I left this house, my husband said, "If you go down there and do that, you don't need to come back." With that, I went down there and I met my son, who wasn't living here with me because he was grown up now. And we went in, and Father Murray was there, but he was going blind. And he said, "Who is it?" And I said, "It's Marion." And we fell in each other's arms, and it was really touching because, you see, the audience could see all this. And we hadn't met in a long time, and it was really very touching. And Mother Murray was not there. She didn't like to go to these meetings. But the other boys were all there. And then that may have been the first time that I ever made a speech to a political meeting, because when I turned around and saw the audience, and I had been in front of people all my life with a violin in my hand, but I didn't have a violin in my hand. Now, 150 lectures later, it wouldn't have bothered me at all. But then I made my remarks, and it came out on a page. And when I got home, I used my key, and I got in, see. My husband was one of these Germans that when he got mad, he wouldn't speak for days. So he wouldn't speak for days. We just went on, and I just ignored it. And finally, he just thawed out so completely, and he was so proud of me, and I didn't know what had happened. Well, one of the members of the musicians union said what happened was the people started pouring into the musicians union where he was secretary and was running it, was the business manager up there. Oh, what a marvelous thing your wife did. And, you know, praising, oh, you're so lucky to have a wife like that that would do a brave thing like that, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly he realized that it was all right.
Well, that's good. Now, when did you meet Mr. Thede?
Mr. Thede. Well, I was principal of the second violins in the symphony for the reason that I was making $40 extra for being principal.
What year was this?
Oh, 1959. And my Mr. Unger, the German, had died.
Oh, okay. So,
yeah.
When did you meet your second husband? I'm sorry.
Well, this
Mr. Unger.
Mr. Unger died. Then I was a widow 7 years by 1959.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided that by then I was teaching in the schools and playing every night in the symphony. I decided that it was just getting too much for me. I could not be principal and lead that section any longer and play the solo parts. And so I moved back one seat, and they got another principal to come in. Well, Fred Thede had been over in Springfield, Missouri, as a musician, and he auditioned and he got the job. So he came over, and the first rehearsal, I looked on the board to see the seating arrangement, and I saw who his name was. So I went up and introduced myself and said, "You're taking my place." He's very, very good-looking fellow, tall and dark and thin. And so we had a very nice talk. He told me about Springfield. He sat down in his seat. I was behind him. I don't think I spoke another word to him the whole year. We'd come in, take our seats, start playing. But the next year, he decided he didn't want that job. It was too hot a seat. Right up there by the conductor, and if there's any person that the conductor is going to ride, it's the second violin principal, the viola principal, and the cello principal. He doesn't want to ride the concertmaster because he doesn't want to lose him.
Yeah.
So Fred decided he wanted that. So he moved back right opposite me, and the fellow that sat there moved up in his seat. So then here these two black guys look at me, and we got to talking. And at the end of the first rehearsal, he said, "By the way, I live up on Northwest 28th. Would you mind dropping me off?" I said, "Don't you have a car?" He said, "No." So I dropped him off. It was 28th or what it was. So whatever it was, 28th or 30th. Anyway, I dropped him off. So then every night I'd drop him off and come home. And so at the next March, we got married up in the Symphony Hall. And that was 8 years after my husband had died. So that's the way I met him.
Well,
You just about got it?
I think so. Do you have any information on the bridge incident with Governor Murray?
None except what I read in the paper and what Frankie told me. It's so funny.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Texas governor didn't know what he was getting into. He didn't even know where the boundary of Oklahoma was. But Father Murray had been a lawyer in the Indian nations. Down there in the Chickasaw Nation, he was a lawyer down there. And my goodness, he researched the records of all the Indian treaties and being intermarried with Douglas H. Johnston, the governor of the Chickasaws. They talked Chickasaw history and Chickasaw treaties and all this, that, and the other all the time. And the governor of Texas didn't even know where his own boundary was. He thought it was in the middle of the river. So Father Murray didn't even have to worry about that because he knew if he got it to the court, why he could show them that the boundary of the Indian Territory was the south bank of the Red River. So that was that. He just simply plowed up his side of the approach, tore down built another bridge, a free bridge. There was a toll bridge, can you imagine? Built a free bridge and plowed up the approaches to the other one. But where the fun came in was that Messina was in the National Guard, in the Oklahoma National Guard. He'd been in the service and was a captain, I think. He shot himself twice in the leg with the same bullet.
How did he do that?
Without taking it out of the holster. I'll never forget. I opened the paper one morning right here in this house. Says, "Governor's son shoots self." My God, what's happened to Messina? Then I read on down. The holster, the gun discharged in the holster, went in here, went down, and went in the calf of the leg.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I guess we have a good interview, really.
Oh, well, I guess so.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say about the colony in South America?
Well, when Frankie and I get together with you, we'll probably sprout off forever about it, because when the two of us who were down there together get to talking, we could remember things.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you might want to ask me questions, but if
Yeah.
you have the time to read through that, you'll come across a lot.
Okay. Now, we'll copy these and give these back to you.
Okay. But this will be the second time they're copied. I don't think that first time is accurate in every respect.
Mm-hmm.
There are some misspellings. There's a lot left out.
I'd like to go down and see the originals at OU.
Yeah.
Are they in the Western History Collection, or where are they?
Now, they were in the archives, but I don't know where they are now. They may be. Don't they have a William H. Murray collection down there?
Now, most of the Murray papers are in the Historical Society.
Yeah, but they also have some.
Oh, they may have them.
Yeah.
Okay. They may be in that collection.
Uh-huh. And I have pictures way up on the Pucabaya River, some of those Indians I'm talking about, those Matacos. I have snapshots of them. I have snapshots of the ones without any clothes on from the waist up. And there are pictures of the old church and the colony grounds. There's pictures of Ojo de Agua. And just a lot of pictures that I just gave a whole slew down there.
I'll see if I can get copies of those then. Okay, thank you.